In March of 2019, we were watching a Nindies Direct, and at the end of a stellar presentation, we heard a slow swell of a familiar theme. Zelda? In a Nindies Direct? And sure enough, Nintendo licensed out the Legend of Zelda franchise to Brace Yourself Games, the indie dev responsible for Crypt of the Necrodancer. Mind you, licensing out first-party franchises isn't entirely new territory for Nintendo, but a spin-off in the style of a pre-existing game by an indie dev, a subset of developers that Nintendo used to want nothing to do with, that was kind of a big surprise. It was a big enough surprise that it led a lot of people to wondering, what other indie devs could Nintendo license out their franchises to and make some really cool stuff? So we're here to talk about it. Let's talk about it. Before we jump straight into some examples, I think it's worth setting some ground rules. We're really going off the inspiration of Cadence of Hyrule here, so that does set some precedents. Number 1, the developer will be an indie studio. Number 2, it'll be a brand new game. And for the last one, what I think is interesting for Cadence of Hyrule is it's a spin-off for a Zelda game. I've heard this kind of conversation going on a little bit in the past, but usually it's kind of like what indie developer could resurrect some dead franchise. And the reason that's a little less fun is typically those are the indie devs that are evolving on the formulas created by the franchises that we're wanting them to resurrect. So it just kind of seems a little circular. Like getting Shinen to make an F-Zero, or Team Cherry to make a Metroid, or Concerned Ape to make an Animal Crossing. That's certainly not to say that I don't want to get any of those games, but I'd rather they just come back in general, and then we get even further content in the same franchises as spin-offs. And plus, that thought process is just a little less fun and creative. Before I go into my ideas, I'm curious to hear what some of yours are. We have a podcast every week where we take the comments and we talk about them, and we also talk about news and all that stuff. It's called Directly to You. There's a link down in the description below. But leave some comments down below kind of while we're talking about this, about indie devs that you'd like to see take other Nintendo franchises. So yeah, go ahead and do that. That'll be fun. All right, let's get into it. In 2018, we saw one of the best tough as nails 2D platformers, Celeste. The game featured tight platforming, generally in isolated rooms with growing platforming mechanics and a deep, heartwarming story. Matt Makes Games put a ton of love into this game and will surely do the same again with the next, and I would love Nintendo to license them out. Ice Climbers. Actually, this one kind of breaks the third rule of mine in that it's not really a spin-off, but then again, we haven't had a new game in this franchise since the NES, so how could you really have a spin-off? It does, however, fit more the mold of Cadence in my mind. I'd like it to follow more the game design of Celeste and use the Ice Climbers in this way. Let's call the game Ice Climbers: Way of the Wind. The NES Ice Climbers game was a 2D platformer where Popo and Nana were making their way up a mountain trying to break platforms, avoid enemies, seeing how far they could go. This much is technically also true of Celeste, although there weren't many corporeal enemies, but rather obstacles. Celeste's progression focused on items and obstacles in the world that interacted with Madeline's basic mechanics, double jump and dash. In Way of the Wind, we will still see Popo and Nana operate somewhat as they do in Smash Bros., but especially in regard to their team jump. Most of the progression will focus around gaining new movement abilities to avoid and navigate the dangers of the world, rather than to kill enemies as in Mario or Donkey Kong. Even using their freezing mechanics as we see them in Smash, they won't kill enemies this way. They would rather just slow them down and turn them into movement opportunities like ice blocks to jump on. I don't have time to go into story ideas now, but I think Matt Makes Games would make a fantastic story for this pair, about working together, about family, about adversity, and isolation. And lastly, since there's only been one game in this franchise, it doesn't really have an identity of its own, so I'd like this game to fill the Nintendo gap of tough as nails 2D platformers. And yes, I know Donkey Kong Country, for example, is quite tough, but because you have to complete whole sections of levels at once, rather than smaller room sections that allow you to retry over and over and over again, it doesn't allow for quite the same level of platforming precision as Celeste does, for example. But speaking of Donkey Kong, this next idea might be a bit tricky, but it would be incredibly cool. In February of 2019, Devolver Digital published a game by Gabe Casillo, Bennett Foddy, and Matt Bosch called APE OUT. We all know our friend Donkey Kong is a strong and powerful, but equally friendly, cute, and happy gorilla who just likes wearing ties and eating bananas. Ape Out gives the exact opposite experience of a gorilla. In this game, you pummel your way through gun-wielding men as you work through a randomly generated maze, deflecting shots and using human shields. And the music is just as chaotic as the character, matching the rhythm of your actions. This is one that would take some tweaking. The base game is way too violent for Donkey Kong, but with a little bit of work, we could make it happen. In this crossover, Donkey Kong Jungle Mountain, our friendly gorilla will still be making his way through randomly generated mazes, but of debris from a jungle mudslide up the side of a mountain. Instead of men shooting at you, you'll be punching through falling palm trees, using barrels as shields and throwing boulders through walls of brush as the jungle falls down around you. At the end of each of the 4 worlds, you'll have to fight a boss that's trying to block your path, because they're trying to destroy the whole island, and you can stop the majority of it if you just make it to the top of the jungle mountain. And the paths would be randomly generated, so there'd be a decent amount of replayability for this budget Donkey Kong title. But speaking of replayability, the Nintendo Switch recently got an amazing deck-building roguelite called Slay the Spire. This title, developed by Megacrit, allows you to make your way through several levels of a progressively difficult world, choosing how to add cards and relics differently throughout every game. It has incredible replayability, and your success largely depends on the synergy of the cards you choose. I think this exact format would be an amazing fit for borrowing the license from Fire Emblem. I know Fire Emblem gets a bad rap because there's so many characters in Smash Brothers, but if we're being honest, Fire Emblem doesn't really get many spin-offs. Of course, we got Fire Emblem Warriors and there's Fire Emblem Heroes on your phone, but besides that, we really just get the main franchise every couple of years, and just that's the same kind of game style most of the time. So a spin-off would be pretty fun. So just how would Fire Emblem Essence of Arthurial play? Well, deck building games are fairly complex in their gameplay minutia, so I couldn't get into details of what cards would do what. However, I think the game's progression should follow along the same path as Slay the Spire, where you can see the map laid out ahead of you, and you can choose a path based on risk and reward. But the core synergistic mechanics should focus around the Fire Emblem sword, axe, lance triangle, with even further risk-reward, where you can have high damage output with a focus on one weapon type across your deck, but be left open to more weaknesses, or keep your deck very even across all 3 types, but not having as much damage to deal, or enchanting some of your cards with different varieties of magic coming from each type. Again, this kind of game requires a ton of balancing and a lot of fine-tuning to make it work. But I think some of the benefits of having roguelites like this is that as a spin-off, it adds to the franchise offerings and longevity of gameplay without bastardizing the sales of the original games themselves. But speaking of roguelikes, one of my favorite roguelikes on the Switch is Dodge Roll's classic little witty title, Enter the Gungeon. It's got so many secrets, the gameplay is fast and fluid, and even though I've never beaten it, it's just so enjoyable to hop in, kill some bullet guys, and hop on out of there. Now, what you wouldn't think is that I'd like Dodge Roll to make a spin-off for the incredibly well-loved Nintendo franchise, Metroid. Although, do take into consideration I'm not implying any kind of specific release window. I think we need to see Metroid Prime 4, Metroid Prime Trilogy, and Metroid 5, the 2D sequel to Metroid Fusion, all of that at some point. So this isn't instead of any of those, this would be in addition. Metroid is one of Nintendo's franchises with an incredibly serious tone. There's practically no lighthearted beats in a Metroid game, and the last time we got something that was less than serious for this franchise, it was Metroid Prime Federation Force and Blast Ball, and that was just a huge mistake. But that's not to say a lighthearted take on it couldn't work, and specifically, the best example actually is our original go-to, Cadence of Hyrule. I would want this game, Enter the Metroid Dungeon, to be licensed in the same exact way as Cadence of Hyrule. Zelda and Link are still pretty serious in that game, other than tapping some toes, and it's just the world around them that's pretty silly. Similarly, Samus would be her regular silent protagonist, and you'd know she's just scoffing at any vague silliness going on around her. All of the enemies would be replaced with the Metroid enemies, and the best part is that both of these games focus so heavily on awesome power-ups and gun upgrades. So same as his guns would just continue to upgrade, but probably in a more permanent type style, sort of like in Cadence of Hyrule, for example. So that way you can actually beat the game, as opposed to Enter the Gungeon, which is hard. I've not beaten it. Not even close. But speaking of one last example, this last one's really exciting to me. I mean, I know it's made up. It's not gonna happen or anything like that, but it just sounds really fun. Of all the characters that are in Smash that we want to play in a standalone game, I think at the top of the list has got to be Captain Falcon. He's just awesome. And even if we see an F-Zero game, I think we need to have something where we can just play as Captain Falcon, walking around on his legs, doing things. Falcon punching people's faces. Kind of. As opposed to my Metroid idea, I want Captain Falcon to actually have a pretty serious tone most of the time. Maybe a bit self-aware, but somewhat intense. And I don't think there's a better indie game to do that than Katana Zero and their developer ASCII Soft. Granted, this is an M-rated game, and I think Nintendo would want to tone it back to T, but I think atmospherically, Katana Zero is a great place to start. A slightly futuristic cyberpunk kind of world where Falcon just gets to go out and beat up bad guys in the seedy underground. Maybe racing has been outlawed after his best friend died in a terrible wreck, and he's trying to make ends meet while taking out his anger through his vigilante work, only to find out not everything is as it seems. I've heard the idea passed around of like a Captain Falcon beat 'em up in the past, and I think that would be great. I don't think Nintendo's gonna do it themselves though, so maybe an indie dev is the best way to go about it. But that's what I think. What do you think? I had some more ideas actually that I couldn't fit in the video, so you should talk about them down in the comments. See if you can come up with anything cool. Shovel Knight and Wario Land, for example. Owlboy mixed with Kid Icarus, Yoku's Island Express and Pikmin, and there were a bunch of other ones, but I don't know, whatever. Let me know all that and more down in the comment section below, and like the video while you're down there, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And then also head on over to our podcast directly to you, where you can hear us talking about some of your lovely comments, and also just hear us talking about the news and other fun things like that. We just hang around and talk, and it's a grand old time. And also join us on our Discord, because we talk to people there, and that's a whole bunch of fun. Also, all those links are down in the description. That's about it. All the social media stuff's down there too, so I don't know, whatever. We're about done. See you guys later. Hasta la pasta.